several other people at the time were also being mentioned. One of these people was Abraham Lincoln. Three things that occurred during 1859 really helped Lincoln's chances for the presidency. First of all, Chicago was the site that was chosen for the Republican National Convention. He was a native of Illinois. Second, he had been giving many addresses throughout the Midwest, and he had started to make a name for himself. And third, many Northeasterners were looking for an alternative to the frontrunner who was a New York senator at the time. And some of the characteristics of Lincoln they really thought were appealing. He had an ability that was recognized. He was an abolitionist, a famous abolitionist, and also he had a good character that was going to be hard to attack by an opposing candidate. So those three things, or those three characteristics, were really working in his favor. So he had been giving many addresses throughout the Midwest at the time, and eventually, sometime in 1859, he was invited to speak in New York at the Brooklyn Church of Henry Ward Beecher, who was a famous abolitionist at the time. Now, after this, he gave a speech at the Cooper Union in New York, which was his most important speech and his most famous at the time. This speech really put Lincoln on the map. People were impressed with the research that he had done and the topics that he was talking about. He talked mainly about slavery, and he talked about the founding of the country. Now, Lincoln had studied for over 6 years. He had studied these two topics, and he was very knowledgeable. People were really impressed with his preparedness of his speech and how effective he was at giving the speech. And they also found, in the Northeast, they also found him sophisticated for somebody from farther west. They were surprised how sophisticated he was in speaking. The most important thing, though, about this speech was that some of the top journalists in New York were actually in attendance. Most notably, William Cullen Bryant and Horace Greeley. So this assured that many of his words were going to be printed throughout the United States in papers, and the words that he said were going to be printed, and people would find out about this. So this was a very important speech for Abraham Lincoln at the time. Now, after this occurred, Lincoln wrote a letter to one of his friends who was also a senator and also had presidential ambitions. And I think two quotes from the letter were really revealing about Lincoln's character and thoughts at the time. First of all, he said, one of his quotes was, "The taste is in my mouth a little." And this showed that he was really getting excited at the time about his chances and the way things were going in his candidacy. But I think more important was what he said after to his friend. He told his friend that he actually warned his friend that not to say anything bad about Lincoln, because other people were watching, and if other people saw that he was saying things bad about Lincoln, they might twist that into opposition for his friend. So even in the most competitive time of Lincoln's candidacy, he was worried about what might happen to his friend. Things were going really well. He was really popular at the time, but he put all that aside. He was really worried about what might happen to his friend. So I think this shows his character. I think it shows his humility, his honesty, and his integrity. And I think that's really what people connected with. So he was starting to make headway at this point, but he really hadn't connected with the public. And two of his friends came with an idea that might help this, or might make this happen. So during the Illinois State Convention, the Republicans, during the proceedings, they interrupted, and they came to the front and said, "We have a famous person from Illinois in the audience that we would like to speak." Now, of course, they were talking about Abraham Lincoln, so they dragged him to the front. He was very serious. He gave a small statement, a few words, and then he sat down at the podium. Now, at this point, two people from the back of the crowd came to the front holding a sign that said, "Abraham Lincoln, the rail candidate of 1860. Rail spelled R-A-I-L. Now, in smaller letters, it said, "The rails that were holding up the sign were cut by Abraham Lincoln on a farm 30 years before." So the crowd saw this, and they started chanting, "I identify your work. They wanted him to identify these pieces of wood that he had, that he'd actually cut on a farm 30 years before. So he took a look at the wood and he said, well, there's no way that I can identify this. There's no way that I can verify that this is actually the wood that I cut. So he asked his friends, where did you get the wood? And they told him, we got this wood on a farm that you and your cousin had worked on 30 years before. So he kept looking at the wood, and the crowd kept chanting, and a smile started to form on his face. He had been pretty serious up to this point, and he kind of understood what was going on, that his friends had kind of set him up with this. So he started studying the wood a little bit more, and he asked what type of wood it was, and they told him. And he said, well, this is a lasting wood. It is possible that I cut this wood, but I can't be for sure. And the crowd kept chanting and chanting. And finally, his quote was at the end, I can only say that I split a great many better looking ones. And at this, the crowd kind of erupted and cheered. We're all very excited about this. And this kind of helped him connect with his audience. This kind of got him connected to the general public. They had been reading about him at this point, but they really didn't know much about him. This kind of built Abraham Lincoln's legend and got him on the map. So this is a very, very important event for his candidacy. So I think of all these things that had happened, all of his speeches and addresses, all this event that I just described, all these things combined really started to put him on the track to gaining the nomination for the Republican Party. But I think the most important thing to Lincoln was he was able to connect to the people. The people could actually see his character in what he was saying. They could see that he cared about the nation. He could speak about national issues, and they really could connect with him. So I think that was the key to his success in his run for president. Thank you.